record this now. So it is recording. So we're going to talk about an aspect of organizational culture today that is kind of subset of what we talked about last month in terms of organizational culture in Jean Rock's presentation. And I hope she's going to have a chance to join us today. But we're going to look at this, and I want to pass on a couple things before we start. And hopefully you'll see this when I move this over. Don't forget that Dropbox has your opening retreat notebook in it. And there's a whole series of folders in there, but there's a couple that are pretty useful. We put all the PowerPoints from presentations, even these ones now, which I do also email out to you, in there. And then there's also another really good folder with references, things like useful YouTube videos, a reading list, and some of the things that I've already sent out to you for the presentation today. So just kind of keep that in your hip pocket, that thing will stay updated, and that will stay there forever. And you'll have access to that for years and years, or at least until we run out of room on Dropbox to put any of those anymore. The things that I sent out to you prior to this meeting, the bibliography on power and complexity and decisions, hopefully you'll find useful. I also sent out an email this morning with a PowerPoint that I'm going to ask you to pull up after a little bit on this decision model. So the reason we're looking at this is, again, it's a subset of the work we do with organizational culture, and it's also part of this visionary organizational leadership block that we work on. This context of culture is incredibly important inside your institutions. And this is Jean's definition that she used, and I added a kind of added on here thing that it's really about how values are lived out within your institution. So I'm gonna ask a question here just from the get-go. So we get into an organization, one of the first ways we understand its culture is to sit and listen and watch and talk to people. But what's a way, if you've determined a culture is dysfunctional, to impact it? And it's a little follow on from Jean's, but anybody chime in on that, on ways you could impact a dysfunctional culture?
I think, as you said, Tom, listening, maybe making sure that new culture is aware that you're available for listening.
Okay. How about anybody else?
I think sometimes asking questions, not necessarily to get the answer, but to have someone else hear what the question is, can be one way.
I think great, Jim. Listening, Denise, asking questions. Anybody else?
I mean, I think there's a point where you kind of have to call it what it is. I mean, and you got to be able to be honest about, hey, this is a culture that isn't congruent with our desired culture, and define the difference, so that you can do something about it.
Yeah, which I mean, I know Concordia, Texas has been going through a whole bunch of aspects of that, and asking the questions in a whole variety of ways. Ann, go ahead.
I would add on to Daniel's comment is that assessment of whether or not things are congruent is there the luxury of time to let this run out, or to let it play itself out? If there isn't, then I think culture is spurred on a little bit by urgency.
Yeah, great point. I'm going to throw in my observation here in terms of this whole question of dysfunctional cultures and ways you can begin impacting is, and y'all have brought this up, is that it starts with you, right? It starts with you in terms of listening and asking questions and ways to address it. It starts with your actions and behaviors. If you become a part of that dysfunctional culture, or you say, no, I'm not going to do that. Because I think, and you'll see as we go through these questions about power and decisions, that the focus ultimately becomes on individuals and what they're willing to do and not willing to do. And so I think you become a really important place, an important point to be able to impact a dysfunctional culture. There, in one of the references I sent out to you was, there are a series of studies that were done. They're called the GLOBE studies. And to be honest, I forget what GLOBE means. Global Leadership Organizational Behavior, something. But take a look, and this is in your references, but this group did this and looked at 6 dimensions of culture. Now, the good news and bad news about these dimensions is, in one sense, they're sort of an artificial construct, and they use a Western perspective on leadership. But they looked at 62 different cultures and tens of thousands of people, and probably broaching 100,000 people, to understand how within different cultures folks look at these different components. I just present that to you because actually the GLOBE studies especially can be helpful if you're looking at other cultures and ways to think about culture. So take a look at that. I think another aspect of this is really how we live out values within the context of those 6 dimensions. And again, in a dysfunctional culture, I think it becomes really important for you, for us at an individual level, and how we can address that. So here's a quote by Dan Allender in his book, Humilitas, about leadership. But he talks about these costs of leadership, these 6 realities. And one of those is complexity. So here's my next question for you. How are our organizations complex? When you think about, do you think, I mean, there's obviously ways that you're organized that are complex, but what is it that makes our organizations complex?
I would say first off, the use of email and communication that can happen because of it.
Nice, really good point. Okay, how about another one?
Hi everybody, this is Mary. I would say complexity because organizations are made of people and people are inherently complex.
Mary, I am 100. I think, and Denise, in your comment about email, it's how people use email that makes it complex. It's fascinating question. And Mary, it's not only that organizations are made of people, but especially in higher education, what's our endpoint? What are we doing? It's all about people. We're not building widgets or bridges or buildings or whatever. What we're doing is dealing with people. So on one side, the complexity is the people inside our organization. The other side of the complexity is our students, and then throwing those all together makes it really complex. Any?
I would add on to that because we're higher educational institutions, we don't always know when we're succeeding.
Ah.
So.
Okay. And again, getting down to people, we don't know. I mean, our goal is to impact people.
Right. How do you measure that?
Yeah.
I'd say that
this is Ben from Portland.
Okay.
Oops, sorry. Can you all hear me all
no,
right?
go ahead, Ben.
You're good, Ben.
Okay. Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with Mary and extend that immediately. My first thought was what Tom said. I thought, well, because we're dealing with students. That's why it's complex. It's not linear, and it's all exponential. So it's as complex as each life expounded by each next life, next to it. So each of them comes in with family, work, etc. And then Daniel, to your point, there's also a Tom, I would say,
Really?
I made him leave. I take it all back. Students are the most linear, predictable. I can wait. I'll wait a second. No.
Got a flower delivery.
That's really funny. We paused, Tom. I thought it was something I said.
No. I mean,
still-
did you see the flowers?
I did. I
uh,
retracted. I said, no, students are the most linear, predictable animals on earth. I was so wrong. Tom, come back.
yeah.
No, I was just going to say, to your point, Daniel, not only are we dealing with students who are messy and complex, and as the email comment says, we are also messy and complex, but higher ed specifically has this like, I don't know, Velcro, where especially maybe Christian higher ed or nonprofit or Lutheran higher ed, people want to stick all sorts of causes and things to it. So I don't know if that's true at other businesses. Maybe it is at larger ones, but at smaller ones, like if you're doing a shoe startup, I don't know, a lot of people are going to stop by and say, hey, you need to be involved with my nonprofit. You're in the neighborhood. You owe me this, that kind of a thing. But we get K-12 barking at us, you know, then we get the alumni barking at us, then somebody's creating a nonprofit idea. And so there's all these pulls that add to the complexity as well. And so Daniel, when you said, well, how do we measure success? That's part of my job here. And I'm always like, it's easy, it's graduation rate. If your graduation rate stinks, it doesn't matter what else you're measuring. Except it's messy because everybody else says, well, sure, but did you pull in donations? Well, sure, did you feed some people in your neighborhood? And it's like, well, maybe we did, but our graduation rate stinks. So what's it going to be? So I guess all that to say, it's messy, absolutely, because we our end product is to improve humans. We're humans, and then everybody kind of wants to tack us onto their cause, which can add a layer of complexity.
Yeah. I think
our
go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say, I think our relationship with the church makes things complicated. I think that being born of and having a deep identity with the church is really it at times can conflict with decisions or growing identity or need to evolve and to be born of and really identify with is different than to be, and so I think that creates a complexity to what we do. Being Lutheran, we tend to be really maybe better than most. I think that at living in that tension, that notion that tension is kind of part of the experience, but it's certainly complicated.
Well, and I think those are all great points. And let me explain the flowers just real quick. My wife's mom died end of last week, and so we've got kids here, and a neighbor just brought that over. I saw her walk in past the windows here, so I knew they were coming. I wanted to get it off the front porch. So this question of complexity, I'm a little bit of a math nut, and there are models that talk about complexity, and they're what's called deterministic. That is, you can put numbers into these models, and they're used in weather forecasting, but they illustrate this idea of complexity kind of clearly. And the model will run just wonderfully, but you change one parameter, 0.1%, and that happens. And it basically becomes a random number generator. So you have this steady state place, and then and Malcolm Gladwell calls them tipping points, right? That there's a tipping point that pushes the system into an unstable mode. And I've always wondered about that in higher education. You can't be afraid of changing things when they're complex, but then you also need to understand and realize the potential for falling off a cliff. And here's characteristics of a complex system, and we have them all. Large number of interacting components, agents. You just all talked about that. Churches, students, faculty members, staff members, community, all those things interacting together. We tend to self-organize hierarchically. Look at faculty and staff. I mean, we have an organizational hierarchy, but even within those, we self-organize. There's kind of a range. When you look at this point, there's a range of stable behavior in here, but then an additional small change can just drive the system crazy. like over here, and that's called emergent behavior. I only point that out that it's just something in the back of our minds we need to understand as we look at what we do, especially in the context of power and decision making, that we work within, we live within, we deal with very complex systems. And, you know, one of the kind of interns or unintended consequences, what you want to do is be able to think about those and then also be ready when something goes bananas. And a major component of all this is this question of power. In a culture, in the organizational culture, where and how does power reside? So here's another question for you. When I talk and use the term power, what is it?
It's the ability to influence others.
Okay, influence others. How about any others?
The ability to be responsible for others.
Hmm?
I look at it more as responsibility.
Okay, responsibility.
The
Yeah, I always
ability-
think of it as kind of this combination of influence and authority.
Okay, okay. Anne, go ahead.
I think of powerful people as people who are able to galvanize
Oh,
people and opinions and group them and get them to go in one direction.
okay. How about others?
I think I've heard power categorized into 3 different categories: power over, power to, and power with.
Nice. Yeah, we're actually going to talk about some aspects of that in a few minutes here. Good one. What I find interesting about power is why in academics, and I notice this more than in other places, do we have such a hard time talking about it? I mean, it is a reality of organizational culture. It is a reality of complex institutions. There is power inside institutions. And it just always seems that we kind of go, oh, no. You know, the president doesn't have any power. This person doesn't have any power. And in fact, it couldn't be further from the truth. Any other opinions on why do you think we have a hard time talking about power in higher ed?
Yes. Yes, I do. Definitely.
Do you think that's inherent to Christian higher education, or would you classify that across the board?
Oh, good question. What do you all think?
I think coming at it from a faculty perspective, at least, reviewing our documents this morning related to shared governance, that's a part of it, is that we create a system where we say that power is shared, and yet it's not shared equally, but we want to pretend that it is. Back to our comment about complexity and people, I don't think we explicitly called out that people in higher education are a very specific type of people. They are driven, they are self-motivated, they are very independent, and they don't like for people to exercise power over them.
Yeah, it's a good point. And that would make it hard to talk about, Devin.
Yeah, this is Ben again from Portland. Piggybacking on that, I would almost look at that second bullet point and think, why do we have a hard time disagreeing about it? Right? Because there's my first thought was, well, as long as I agree with the other person, it's actually pretty easy to talk about power and to nod and to say, you're right, you know, this is a deficit, or that's an extreme, or you're exactly as you describe you, whatever it may be. But when it comes time to disagree or work on it or do something about it, all of a sudden definitions seem to shift and expectations and so forth.
Okay, good point. Here's a quote. I'm sure you've all heard this quote about power always corrupts. Well, this fellow, Robert Caro, and I think, you know what, I need to get where I found this, but I think it was in a newspaper in Chicago. What I love about this is his conclusion that is power always reveals. And what does it reveal? It reveals behind it, I think, motivation, integrity, and character, all those things. and how you use power reveals those aspects of both individually and individual culture and organizational culture. And here's just a book definition of power in this question about influencing decisions and control and 3 forces of leadership. Where I'm taking that from, and I should have the quote, I have it later on down below, the reference for this is out of Nordhaus's book on leadership. So when we look at power and think about it, this is one way to look at it. There are 2 classic types. Here's the Nordhaus reference that classic folks that do this think about. First is position power, and the second is personal power. And position power, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. You all can read this. It fits sort of the classic things that deal with authority and hierarchies in position, right? You do have, in a certain positions, legitimate power to make decisions and move on, and those other ones. I find personal power a lot more interesting. Position power being those sort of specified. Personal power is one that people try to accrue, I think, through various ways. You know, whether you're an expert, whether there's a charismatic way to get it, or prestige power. But these 7 aspects of power are very important for people to understand. And this next thing, you're all going to think I'm kind of nuts, but it's relatively important. There is a great book. Has anybody heard of the book 48 Laws of Power?
Well,
I'm not saying you should read this book from front to back, but it is a very interesting way to look at all these aspects of position and personal power. What the author does is look at 48 laws, and each law of power has about 10 to 15 pages with it. It's a pretty good sized book about the history of that particular aspect of power, everything from back from the Middle Ages forward. But I just thought these kind of are chuckles. Our daughter read this. She was here for the funeral and everything, and she said, "Dad, are you Machiavellian? I mean, what is the point of this? Are you going to use this?" And I don't think it's important for us. It's important to understand power. I'm not saying you should use a list of 48 laws to sit down and go, well, I think I'm going to use law 2 and 3 right now. But I think it's understand it within the context of culture is very important, and to understand who might be using these various aspects of power in your relationship. With an organization I worked with, I actually copied the index of this book to a meeting and took it to a meeting of a bunch of CEOs and said, you need to understand when people are using these aspects of power inside your organizations, both for or against what may be happening. Because they're really pretty straightforward ways of thinking about that. So I just put this on the table for you all to think about as an aspect of power, and along with those other references. And this is kind of now a classic in the question of power. But I've got 2 more questions for you. The first one is, where, when, and what type of power have you used, and where, when, and how are power been used within your organization? So the first one is, when have you used power? And I'm not saying it's bad or good. When have you used it?
I mean, each meeting that you're at, I think that there are small things that, you try to exert your influence on, and, make sure that the group, the team that you're in the meeting with, is convinced that, yeah, that's the right way to go. I think we do that a lot as we try to convince people of things, no matter really where we are in the food chain of power.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, Tim.
One of the things that I liked about the previous slide, or one of the previous slides, is the separating of power from position.
Okay.
Because it opens the possibility that you can use power working upwards rather than just downwards. I'm thinking of a situation last week where we had a curricular proposal coming to our faculty assembly that, in my view, had not been adequately discussed, hadn't been, this is for a significant curricular change, not just a minor tweak. And the fact that I don't often complain about those kinds of things, I'm not not someone who's be oppositional just for the sake of being oppositional, being able to go to my provost and say, hey, we're creating a problem here, and have him then say, okay, let's pull this off the table and we'll come back to it later after we've had more time to look at it. I think that is an exercise of a certain type of power, but it's not from my position. It comes from the track record.
That's a perfect example of expert and referent power. Perfect. And and what's the basis for that? It's trust, right? Mm-hmm. If the provost hadn't trusted you, that would not have happened. How about other examples of where you've used power? See, we're having a hard time talking about it. I think making up the agenda for a meeting is an exercise in power, right? Because okay, one fighter pilot story for this whole thing, and it'll be the only one I do, maybe. But when we would come back from flights and everything we did was video and audio recorded, everything. And we used to joke, and you would spend hours afterwards going through all this. But we joked that the first person to the whiteboard with a magic marker would drive the discussion because they defined the agenda. So even defining an agenda is an act of exerting power. But I'm not saying it's bad or good. It just is. And we need to be aware of those things.
I find I always have an expectation of an agenda for a meeting, what is the agenda, or whose meeting is this? And so if I enter a meeting and there isn't an agenda, I do like to call the question and have everybody look at who called the meeting and what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, good point. And by the way, you're exerting, like Devin did, expert and referent power right there to even ask that question in the beginning.
Some power. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really. And again, not good or bad, but you're calling to question, what's the point of this if we don't even know ahead of time what we're talking about? And not to be too Machiavellian, but the book 48 Laws of Power would say when somebody doesn't do that, provide an agenda before a meeting, they are actually exercising power because they don't want to let you get control of information, right? Now, it may be negligence or just incompetence, I get all that, but in one sense, they're trying to keep discussion off the table. So again, I just put these questions on the table for you all to think about as you go about your work. And then the other side of it is just to be aware when you use power that you do, and that you do it with integrity and character. And then also when and where and how has power been used within your organization, and the potential for where that has gone well and where that has gone not well. Okay. One of the things that happened, and Dan knows this from our relocation, Dan, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a big discussion about how everybody's offices were going to be painted. And it was really interesting because, some people wanted like a beige office or green or whatever. And basically Dan at that time's supervisor, Dr. Kluth, and I and the board all sat down and said, we're buying a bazillion gallons of one color of paint. And that was an exercise, but it was a cost benefit analysis. It was all kinds of things. And we just bought a bazillion colors of one kind of paint. And everybody got the same color office. An exercise in power. So given all that complexity, the background of power inside an organization, both hierarchical and personal, why does this happen? And that's a really, really hard question.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with just kind of, it's the nature of organizations to be political. You have leadership, and so I don't necessarily view that as a bad thing, but it's just a function of an organization a lot of times. It's also a function of limited resources, and so when you've got to put resources somewhere, you got to say yes to some things and say no to other things, and in doing so, you create discussion, you potentially create conflict, and so you create an environment where influence is required, where prioritization is required, and all those things are functions of politics, or politics are functions of those things. And so, again, I think politics are inherent to organizations. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a function of how we get things done. But it's when they're, used poorly is when, or weaponized is when they're a bad thing.
Yeah, and Denise, I think you and Dan, you've both used the term influence here a couple of times. So we're going to talk about that in a couple more slides. Any other thoughts on that? Are there any characteristics you would look like in an organization where, and Dan, you made an important point, objectively, organizational politics are part of, because we're complex organizations of human beings that exist. But most of the time when we talk about this, we put a filter on it and say it's bad.
Right.
So it can be good. It can be a means of transmitting ideas and things. But when this
it's a shame. It's really a shame that it can't be turned around and motivated as this continuous improvement assessment kind of view towards it, instead of that negative connotation. That's in the alternate reality dream world of mine.
Yes, please. How do I go to there?
Yeah.
Can you buy us a plane ticket?
Aristotle defines politics as is the affairs of the city. That's what the word politics comes from. That it's just a function of the city, right? And so politics are the function of the organization. And so it's just again, when it becomes weaponized is when it becomes a problem.
Well, and I think when we look at, and that term weaponized is really interesting. Another way to look at organizational politics is, how do you get stuff done?
Yeah.
Right?
How do you get stuff?
How do you get from A to B inside an organization? Understanding, obviously, the big topics like organizational culture and power and money and all that stuff that runs around inside it. But, and I know you all have seen models like this where there's this kind of notional hierarchical structure to get things done. Then there's the real way you get things done, right? You hear about that as soon as you get into an organization. We had that military, the military, how much more hierarchical can you get than that? I mean, especially when everybody wears the rank. But then you said, oh yeah, but here's the way you really get this done. You find a tech sergeant somewhere that knows the tech sergeant the 2 squadrons over, and they're the one that's going to get the part you need for the airplane. Don't go up and down. But I think it's understanding how things get done inside an organization also, the informal and formal channels for that, the hierarchical and informal. So this is a reference for y'all just to look at 4 metaphors for organizational politics. And the 2 axes here, the bottom one is the source of power, informal or formal, and where political activity takes place, either at the individual level or the organizational level. So power, informal, formal, individual, and organizational. And there are 4 descriptors, and I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time going through each one of these. But you can imagine that here in the weeds is where individual and informal networks of power and relationships all get things done. And then up here, it's a very bureaucratic reliance on organizational ways to get things done. And then these 2 are sort of in between aspects of both of those. But it's a way to think about it. And it's out of an article in Harvard Business Review back in 2016. And if you get more interested in this, you may want to go ahead and take a look at this article. And I have more articles referenced in some of those handouts I sent to you. So again, something to think about in what those organizational politics happen. But I use that as a framework to say, picking out which of these four is how do you get stuff done? You know, how things happen inside the organization. So several of you have mentioned this topic of influence, and John Maxwell would say that leadership is influence, period, dot, end of statement. That's what it's about. How you influence people, how you influence processes, how you influence the organization. And Cashman goes a little bit further on influence, and authentic, real influence is something that creates value. So, how has anybody here ever had an influence attempt on them? I mean, how do people try and influence you? How does that happen?
All the time. I mean, you know, excuse me, here's a cup of coffee. Can I change my parking space? I mean,
yeah, I mean, great point, Denise. I think we always think it's rational. You know, I worked in this think tank in the Air Force. Okay, this is not a fighter pilot story, but still an Air Force story. And kind of the way we worked was we just thought logically, if we had the right number of charts and graphs with the right slopes on them and everything, it would be intuitively obvious to somebody at the end that this was the most reasonable way to go down the road, right? Rational, very logical, rational, put it all in an equation and it falls out.
yeah, that don't work all the time. You need creativity in there, the art person says.
Go back to complex systems and bunches of people, right?
Messy, messy. Yep.
Yeah. How about any other comments on influence? How do people attempt to influence you? Or how do you attempt to influence people? Okay, well, we'll come back to that. I'm going to go through classic, and this is out of Nordhaus again, influence tactics that you see. And obviously this first one I just talked about here, kind of rational persuasion. I think the one we see most often in higher education and in nonprofits is consultation. Here, using that as a way to influence people. Maybe Denise, I don't know if that buying you coffee was an attempt at ingratiation. Maybe not. I think it's one you need to think about. But these 5 and then these ones. So there's 9 of them here. I always tell a story. I loved Penny's dad was an amazing guy. He was a steel worker his whole life, grew up in Pittsburgh, but he was an exchange person. When you worked with her dad, if he did something for you, he expected you to do something for him. And there was a constant bank account somewhere of that stuff in the background, right? And when it was balanced, life was okay. When it was not balanced, he never wanted to be obligated to somebody, but he was okay with somebody being obligated to him because there was a green stamp or something, a favor he could call in. Lots of times you'll see coalition tactics happening inside your organization. Hi, Steve, how you doing? And the same with legitimating tactics.
Tom, can I jump in there with a question on those?
Oh, sure, Devin.
And it's kind of a twofold question. One from your perspective, but the other from the perspective of whoever came up with whose name I've forgotten. Are they presented as value neutral?
Ah, good question. Like power, they can be value neutral. But in this kind of wraps all up into that crazy book on the 48 laws of power, because they can be used not value laden. Does that make sense? Where you can use inspirational appeals, like let's take a case of inspirational appeals where everybody got killed. Jim Jones, that thing back in Guyana where, you know, he was leading this incredible religious group and his inspirational appeal was everybody's against us. And I mean, he used a bunch of influence tactics off this list of 9 to get people to go kill themselves. So
I guess my reason for asking is that a number of these look to me to be value neutral. They're things that can be used for good or for ill. A couple of them just feel kind of icky to me, regardless of the purpose that I'm using them for. The exchange model just does not sit well with me.
Okay.
And I did you a favor, so now you owe me something.
Yeah.
Even if we use that to make positive change.
Yeah. Well, and ingratiation, that's one that's icky to me. I mean, really? And watch for that to happen. And I think you bring up a really good point. I mean, things like rational persuasion. Now, here's rational persuasion used ickily, if that's a word. I'm not sure if ickily is a word. But in this Air Force office I talked about, we were doing a very complicated presentation, and I went to our big boss beforehand, and I ran through the presentation, and this was going to like the big folks. And we had a series of, it was very rational, very logical presentation. And I had a series of equations in it to explain the models that we were doing, but I took them out and put them in backup. And so it was a very rational thing. And with the equations, it's been very rational, but I went through it with the big boss and he said, Tom, where are the equations? And I said, sir, I put them in the back because nobody's going to understand them. And his point to me was, that's fine, put them back in. They need to know we understand them and they don't. Right? So that's one way to look at it, I guess, in terms of influence. We were trying to do rational, but we were also poking people in the chest, saying, you're out of this. We know the answer. Follow us. And pressure, I mean, you know, obviously the pressure, and this is a really good point. Some of these, like the pressure one too, can be really used to intimidate people, and that's obviously a very value-laden way to do things. So I wanted to get to these two questions. So here, and this is a very personal question, and you need to think about this. What are the influence tactics you use most often? Anybody want to throw that on the table?
Our department in general is very consultative, just in the nature of how we work. So I would definitely say the consultation influence is one that I use frequently.
I would echo that, but pair it with the inspirational.
Ah, okay.
Having people consult on something, but also convincing them that we're working towards something that connects to their values.
What's interesting, Cotter in change theory, the Heaths and Cotter, if you remember, we talked about change. They really argue for this as an influence tactic in change operations. When you're having major change, and this was building a coalition, gradually bringing people on board, influencers on board to support the change effort.
You know, oddly, I think in development, I look at that list and we pretty much use all of them in some way, shape, or form, except maybe the last one. That's the one that I have the hardest time legitimating tactics. That's the one I have the hardest time squaring. But even then, we say, you know, hey, this is a priority of the president. You know, we have to make this happen for the good of the institution. You know, so I can see instances where I've probably employed every single one of those.
Okay. Yeah, you just run up and down the list and probably invent a couple more.
Well, I don't know about that.
Any other comments on this? How about times when they've been used with you or using you in these? Have you ever been somebody come up and talk about a coalition or using rational persuasion or ingratiation even? And Denise, I don't know about buying a cup of coffee is really ingratiation, but
Sorry, I go to humor first.
yeah. No, but I think just like power, it's really important. And again, not too Machiavellian, but you need to know these things are happening in the background inside your organization. They just do. And how you get things done, what these structures look like, are really, really important.
I also think it's important to look at all of those because I think if we're being honest, all of those things have been used towards us, whatever verb you want to use there. But, and really thinking about those ones, what was the most effective used on us as a way to start to think about it when we have to choose one of those to use on another person to achieve what we achieve. You know.
Great point. So this now gets us, as we look at complexity, power, influence tactics, organizational politics, this whole thing that you're paid the big bucks for, making decisions, right? How do we do that within this organizational culture context and all the things that Jean talked about last month, all this stuff on top of that? And this is a quote from a paper this woman wrote in the Washington Post. It's getting kind of old now, but I'll just give you a minute to read that. And I love this question of indecisiveness. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly been places where somebody wouldn't make a decision and it just drives you crazy. And it puts it in a time domain that you lose opportunities. This also, and the other thing that she brings out here is, and this fellow Hogan that she's talking about, is that we lose their teams, we lose our teams when our followers withdraw their consent for us to lead them. So here's two really good resources on decision making. So again, I'll send the slides out, and they're also listed in the references that I sent out earlier for this. And also there are some good tools on the web. This one in particular is fee-based, but it gives you different methodologies. I'm going to talk about one today that we're going to go through here as we close. These are things you all need to think about in terms of traps when you go to make decisions. And most of these are out of that HBR article. This one is in the references as a YouTube video you can watch, that it's really good. But this, and real quickly, this anchoring one is really important because it's usually the first information to the table. And then I love this one about estimating and forecasting, especially when we take information and try and estimate and forecast outside the range of the data. And you see people do that all the time. You know, it's based on budgets and cash flow analyses, potential student populations, demographics. We're always extrapolating outside the range of the real data we have. So you need to keep these in mind. I'm going to advocate for you a way to think about how to make decisions. And so this is really no big brainiac way to think about it, but it's a definition for decision making. It's a way to an end. It's a way to get something done. It makes choices. There's all kinds of things here. Here's a reference, but we're going to talk about one particular model for decision making. And it's the Vroom-Yet-Nyong'o decision model. Those slides I sent to you earlier this morning, and if you can pull those up on your computer. And my point about bringing this forward for you is not that you should pull this model out of your desk drawer every time you need to make a decision. But what's interesting about the model is it gives you a series of questions to ask as you go down the road in making decisions that can be helpful in deciding where you end up and whether you make the decision or it's more of a consulting model, like Devin, that you brought up. So here are the 8 questions that they argue you need to think about in making a decision. And what this thing looks like, I'm going to slide something over. And the next slide is a flow chart that you walk through to a decision model over here on the right. So these are the questions, and you know, they range from pretty interesting ones like technical quality, team commitment. Do you have the information to make it? Is it structured? If you make it, is your team going to be committed? Is there potential conflict over this? Does the team itself have enough information to make a quality decision? And then these are the different types of decision styles, ranging from you make the decision yourself based on the information available, to a fully consultative model that you share a problem with your team, and then you evaluate alternatives and attempt to reach the agreements. And then again, here's this flow chart, and I'm going to try something here where I can annotate this, and we'll see if it works. So the first question down here, oops, now I don't have my questions up, is this question of how important is the technical quality of the decision? Let's say it's pretty high. You would then, and I'll say something like, maybe it's buying a new computer system for your school, the servers. Well, in that case, it is obviously pretty high. And so you go up to this next question, and how important is team commitment to that? It may or may not be high, but you can see that you go down these very branches that help get you to some type of decision model over here by asking these types of questions. I know it's not a real simple model, but I think if you take some time and look through these questions, they can be helpful for deciding where you're going to go. But let me step back a little bit. Given a model like this and a framework, which is terrific and great, we live and work in complex systems, and it's sometimes important to understand what unintended consequences may be of what you're doing. So let me give you an example of that. I was part of a nonprofit one time that was in the midst of doing a new building, and there was a lot of conflict over the building and issues kind of going on. And a decision came up for buying chairs. Now, one would think buying chairs would be a relatively simple decision, and that somebody would kind of go up to this direction and go eventually up here. Yeah, I can make this. Let me put the pencil back on again. I can make this decision. It's important, but I can make it, and everybody's going to be okay with it. What happened in this case was that was the logic behind the decision, and it was made, and it turned into a huge furball. And it wasn't the decision itself, it was the fact that people were not engaged along the way in all these other decisions that were being made in this process of outfitting the building. 3 years later, I was asked about making a decision about chairs, and I went, oh no, not this again. So we actually went through a more consultative way, but it turned out to be no big deal because all those previous issues were off the table. It didn't matter. And in fact, what I got was, when I tried to do more of a consultative model like here was, hey, it doesn't matter, just go buy chairs. Nobody cares. Just buy chairs. So again, I just want you to know, always keep in mind in the background using this model, this question of complexity and the potential for unintended consequences as we get down the road. So let me get off this. There we go. Don't want to do that anymore. So sorry, it's the drawing stays on the chart. I don't know how to get rid of that. But what are some ways to ensure your group is able to reach the best decisions possible? Just a couple of questions here at the end.
I would say make sure the team feels empowered.
Okay.
They can speak their mind honestly.
Okay. How about other ideas?
Yeah, I think just working to be on the same page about what the overall goal is, then that makes the getting there a whole lot simpler, and that the conflict feels less conflicty. If you get halfway through and you realize that you're aiming at two different targets, then you're going to go, oh, well, that's why this has been a total mess, the whole way along. So I think just ensuring all along the way that you're always still aiming at the same target.
Okay. How about other ideas? Hey, Ben, can I call on you? You've been in an institution that's been making lots of decisions lately.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it, I guess, along a spectrum, Tom, of
Yeah. And I'll be off the record here, Ben, just
yeah.
so between you and me, I think transparency has been an issue there.
Yeah, I suppose. Again, it's a little bit, maybe my brain went to what I was talking about before. So the expectation that people have for transparency in and of itself is a fascinating study of, well, you know, why do you feel that you do you feel like you should be involved in that process, or do you feel like anyone in your position, the next person in your position, should be involved in it as well? So the expectations that people carry are often personal, and they're often sort of professionally infused.
Yeah.
And then there's this other layer of like, well, there's the professional expertise that I carry. So even though I am position X, boy, I could really help with decision, you know, Y over here. And I'm not any better than the next at sorting that out myself when I see things occur and I think, you know, why was I not included in that? Well, because I have nothing to do with what I'm doing. Or, well, because I was overlooked, you know, or
Yeah.
because person X and I have trouble, or I don't know, I'm just upset about it. It is interesting. One of the things that I used to work at Clark College across the river in Washington State. And at Clark College, they had 3 unions plus an entire group of people that did not
Wow.
have union representation. So really there was 4 things going on. And one of the things I did learn from that is that in various meetings, people would have their name tags in front of them, and their name tags would be color-coded to indicate who was here, who could vote, who was here only to listen, no talking, and who was here to provide and sort of infuse information and insight into the conversation. And on the one hand, sometimes the lines were a little artificial and it was goofy, but at the end of the day, it was clear. And it was certainly this, it was certainly a route to ensure or try to get to the best decision. Whether it worked or not, I suppose, is debatable, but it was an interesting way to proceed.
Okay.
And at Concordia Portland, probably like yours, these lines are not as clear.
Okay, good point. How about others? I put down a list of things to think about. And when I say use the model, what I'm really talking about is using the questions in the model to help you think through how you might go about making the decision. Then I think that the next couple are important. Understanding the traps, review that list of traps in there. Sometimes you're going to get 100% consensus, but it's going to be rare. And then making whatever process you use transparent. At least to say, here's how we went about this. And maybe the other word I would use there is explainable. Then you can actually explain how you reach your decision. Can be an important aspect of decision making. So that's it, sports fans. Complexity, power, influence. Sounds like a movie we could write, you know? And then finally getting to decisions that are in contexts that we all live in organizations. Closing questions, comments? Don't all run out and buy 48 Laws of Power, because you got to take your time reading that book. It'll get you depressed.
I did order from the library just now.
Did you really?
I did. So I didn't buy it, you know, but Hey, I do need to go zip to an 11 o'clock here on the Pacific Coast, but thank you all very much. Have a great week, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
Bye-bye,
But
Ben.
again, the book can be a tough read, and you get very skeptical when you're done with it. But it's useful in a whole bunch of different ways. Going around the horn for last comments.
We've run into situations lately, just to offer a comment, of issues getting conflated with each other.
Ooh,
So
good
I
one.
guess that's one thing we've noticed is we think we're making one decision and we're really making two. So separating those two out has really helped people get on board with things and knowing we're not fixing X, we're fixing Y.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, great point. Yeah, really good point. Always understanding. Gets back a little bit to what Dan and Denise, a couple of folks have been saying earlier about how these processes go down the road. Really good points. Note to all, I'll be sending out, Jai will be sending out an updated schedule here pretty quickly, and we've got to catch up with a couple of folks that got lost in an email system, but we'll get that fixed too. So thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving and Christmas. Looking forward to the mid-year retreat. It'll be fun to be back together again and share stories. We're anxious for that to happen. So all the best.
Great.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You betcha.